Hi, everybody. This video is part 2 of an episode on John Neihardt I recorded last year, but didn't get around to editing till now. In part 1, which if you haven't watched, you should look at that first, I said that Neihardt was the first state poet laureate, but after I published the video, the poet Dana Joya pointed out to me in the comments section that this is actually not the case. That honor belongs to Ina Coolbrith, who was named the Poet Laureate of California 6 years before Neihardt was in Nebraska. So, sorry about that. I probably made other errors too, but nobody pointed them out to me, so I don't know what they are. Anyway, enjoy part 2 of this episode. So, after Neihardt wrote Hugh Glass and The Song of Three Friends in 1921, he was named Poet Laureate of Nebraska when he was 40 years old. So the question is, why did Nebraska choose to venerate this man? Well, here's what it says on the historyofnebraska.gov website. The legislator recognized Neihardt's national epic, where he has developed the mood of courage with which our pioneers explored and subdued our plains, and thus has inspired in Americans that love of the land and its heroes, whereby great national traditions are built and perpetuated. So, I don't think anyone today would celebrate someone for writing about subduing our plains. These are obviously very different times. But this is what the Nebraska legislature cited. The website goes on to say how Nebraska in 1921 was a rough and unromantic place, dirt roads, small farms, and plenty of work that was still horse-powered, full of practical-minded people. Neihardt didn't really fit in, but people thought that he was doing for Western American history what the ancient bards had done for Greece and Rome. He was placing America within a grand and noble tradition. And again, this is a very different type of approach than what the elite liberal poets today are doing, being just relentlessly critical of America. And it's also different from what poets in New York were doing in Neihardt's own lifetime, developing the modernist trend that continues today. Now, I've already said that Neihardt was Poet Laureate for 52 years, from 1921 to 1973. It was a lifetime appointment. It was not one of these revolving door laureate positions like we're used to today, where, there's a different poet laureate every year, and they're just completely forgettable. So let's return to the next poem that occurs in the arrangement of Neihardt's five epics. And this is the Song of Jed Smith. This was actually the last epic that Neihardt wrote, although chronologically it's the third. It's about Jedediah Smith, a very famous explorer. He is credited with opening the land west of the Rocky Mountains to the American settlement. He discovered the South Pass. He was the first man to reach California over land and then to travel to Oregon from the coast, the first to cross the Sierra Nevada to travel the Great Basin. He also survived several massacres of fur traders by natives. And Neihardt takes his indirect method of narration to an extreme here. It's completely narrated from the perspective of people who knew Jed Smith, who are sitting around remembering him, trying to piece together his life and adventures after his disappearance and death at the hands of Comanches. And, like I said, given Neihardt's method of obtaining information about these fur trappers, they're not as close in time to him as people like Black Elk, who were his contemporaries, and directly participated in the events that occur in volumes 4 and 5. In the case of the first three volumes, his information is secondhand from very old fur trappers, or more likely from books. Now, in this case, Neihardt would have been too young to have known the three trappers who provide the dramatic framework for Jed Smith's story, who are respectively Arthur Black, Robert Evans, and George Wood Ebbert. Each of them were with Jed Smith at different points in his travels. Arthur Black, for example, was with Jed Smith one of only 4 men who survived the Umpqua massacre of 1828. But even though he relied on written accounts to write this, his anthropological method was fully developed by this point, and he emphasizes how the different speakers cast doubt on whether their perspectives represent the true account of Jed Smith. The point being that out in the wilderness where no one is around, it's hard to know what really happened. They're all seen through a glass darkly. The conversational nature of the poem gives it a less action-oriented and more contemplative tone. It's a very philosophical poem. It opens with the fur trappers sitting around, and then there's this passage. Now while they mused, there came an eerie change upon the world. From where the day lay dead, the ghost thereof in streamered glory fled across the sky, transfiguring the scene. Amazed amidst the otherworldly green that glowed along the flat, as though a shout had startled them, they stood and stared about, searching the muted landscape of a dream. Then, later in chapter 4, the character Robert Evans is describing how these trappers inhabit a transcendent world that is, quote, rooted deep in what I call the other side of things, where running feet are skilled and eager wings are folded, and all seeking is forsaken, because there's nothing to be overtaken in such a piece of being. Neihardt's biographer, Timothy Anderson, writes about this that the Song of Jed Smith offered Neihardt the opportunity to explore his own mystical view of life, the belief that everything is connected, that things are happening just outside our reach that we cannot understand. Mystics understood this, and Smith, in Neihardt's view, was one of those mystics. This mystical, contemplative tone is also reflected in the fact that while there are biblical references in this poem, I did not detect any classical references of the kind that you find in the Song of Three Friends or Hugh Glass, references to Virgil or Apollonius. So instead of, for example, a scene in Hugh Glass where Hugh finds a rusty knife and it becomes this symbolic parody of Excalibur in this epic simile about Arthurian legend, the symbols in this poem are more naturalistic. The yucca tree, for example, is a symbol of transfiguration. In chapter 4, we encounter an image of ghostly yucca trees around us there, transfigured by some ultimate despair that filled the stillness of the solitude. And then later in chapter 5, when Smith and Evans are crossing the Great Basin, Evans is very weary and they encounter a yucca tree that is described as praying with its wide arms waiting wearily for rain, and is compared to a crucified ghost that died of thirst. Then Evans has a vision of the yucca tree flowering, drinking in a rain of glory, making beauty out of pain and ugly need. And Evans' fatigue then dissipates. It's a complex image that references the legend that a dying Adam would be saved when the tree of knowledge flowered, and that the cross bloomed when Christ was crucified. But again, the symbolism is done in a very naturalistic way. Unlike when Jules Le Bon's cowardice and greed is ironically compared with Aeneas escaping Troy to found Rome. I think that given that this was the last installment of the epic, Neihardt was getting old. He was around 60 when he was finishing this. He was moving beyond his earlier youthful ambition to just showcase his erudition in favor of, as Anderson notes, embracing this more mystical worldview. There are a lot of religious connotations to Jed's character. In the twilight of his life, he is looking at the bigger picture of things with his mature vision of the universe. Now, Neihardt's mystical worldview at this point basically seems to be a synthesis of the biblical Christian worldview with a Native American pantheism, which makes sense since Neihardt, living on the frontier near an Indian reservation, talking to old tribesmen, was a product of these two worlds. And as far as that goes, you can take it or leave it. But one has to admit that the poetical expression of this mysticism is quite powerful and beautiful. In chapter 5, the slow, hushed solitude of pine that grows darker, darker, listening, is compared with the everlasting word. And the question arises, what is the everlasting word in Neihardt's sense? Hold on to that thought because I'm going to return to it later, towards the end. Despite the merits of this third poem, the depth and contemplativeness and symbolic power, I still didn't like it as much as Hugh Glass. And really, I'm revealing my own prejudices here. This doesn't necessarily reflect a difference in objective quality. But I do wish, like some previous installments, but even more so, I do wish that it were more action-oriented, and especially less focused on problems of interpretation. Because Jed Smith was an amazing guy who had all these incredible adventures. And I don't think those adventures really totally come through here. You can have the contemplative elements, but ultimately Jed Smith isn't Dante in heaven conversing with dead philosopher saints like Thomas Aquinas. He's a guy in the middle of nowhere struggling against the elements. This is a story of survival. And just like I feel Neihardt should have more directly narrated the bear attack on Hugh Glass, however much you may have to fictionalize that in its reconstruction, I wish Neihardt would have just shown Jed Smith, escaping Indian attacks and stepping into California for the first time, instead of describing these things secondhand. So much gets left out because the characters weren't there. Earlier, I compared Neihardt to Herodotus in terms of his research methods. But the difference between the two is that while Herodotus presents different cultural perspectives, he doesn't get hung up on interpretation. He narrates the Battle of Thermopylae directly, as if he were a first-hand observer. And it's such a great read because of that. And it would have been so much less entertaining if he said, well, we think Leonidas might have said this, but who really knows what happened? So in the end, I would rank Jed Smith a 7 out of 10. A flawed masterpiece. Moving on, the Song of the Indian Wars. This is the longest of the 5 poems. The other poems all run to about 100 pages each. This one is almost twice that length, and it is also generally considered to be the best. It's gotten the most positive attention from scholars, and I also think that it's the best. So a few episodes back, I talked about Torquato Tasso and the liberation of Jerusalem. And in that epic, the Christian knights are good and the Muslims are bad, though there are flashes of humanity there. This is not the case in this epic. Each side is humanized, and each is portrayed in both its noble and its more vicious elements. The settlement of the frontier is described in the opening chapter thus. Were all the teeming regions of the dawn unpeopled now? What devastating need had set so many faces pale with greed against the sunset? And Neihardt goes on to describe the unscrupulous behavior of white settlers and how the tribal warriors fought back. Every day some oxrig creeping California way, that paradise of every hope fulfilled, was plundered and the homesick driver killed, forlornly fighting for his little brood. So the white settlers demonstrate greed, but also the hopes of families. The native tribes fought to preserve their way of life, and themselves did some terrible things in the process. All of this is to say that this is what happens when two incompatible ways of life smash up against each other. And Neihardt does a great job of showing the complexity of this conflict. He is neither a westward ho manifest destiny defender, although that perspective does kind of come through in some of the earlier works. It's totally absent here. And he is also not a primitive anti-colonialist. He is an artist. This is what great art does. And we really see this early on in the story when the great tribes all come together for a council. There are a lot of names that pop up of the various chiefs and warriors, and this is where the footnotes are really helpful to keep track of all the different characters. So they're deciding what to do about the continual encroachment of their land. And then Red Cloud speaks up. The feast now being finished, Red Cloud stood, still pondering his words with mouth set grim. But men felt thunder in the hush of him, and knew what lightning struggled to be wise behind the hawk-like brooding of the eyes. The chipped flint look about the cheek and jaw. The humming of a hustling autumn flaw in aspen thickets swept the waiting crowd. It seemed his voice would tower harsh and loud. It crooned, "My friends, 'twas many snows ago when first we welcomed white men. Now we know their hearts are bad, and their words are lies. They brought us shining things that pleased the eyes, and weapons that were better than we knew. And this seemed very good. They brought us to the spirit water, strong to wash away the coward's fear, and for a moment stay the creeping of old age and gnawing sorrow. My friends, if you would have these things tomorrow, forget the way our fathers taught us all. As though you planned to live till mountains fall, seek out all things men need and pile them high. Be fat yourselves and let the hungry die. Be warm yourselves and let the naked freeze. So shall you see the trail the white man sees. And when your teepee bulges to the peak, look round you for some neighbor who is weak, and take his little too." And then a little further down. Are we cowards? Shall we stand unmoved as trees and see our motherland plowed up for corn? Increasing as he spoke, the smothered wrath now mastered him, and woke the sleeping thunder all had waited for. Out of a thrilling hush he shouted, War! So, a moving speech. Neihardt is very Homeric here in the way that he heroizes the doomed struggle of the native tribes. Much like Hector and the Trojans are heroized. You know they're going to lose, but you're rooting for them anyway. And Red Cloud's speech is effective in dramatizing the rightness of their cause. Now, I read a dumb analysis of this passage in an essay by Daniel Clausen on the Poetry from the Plains website, which goes as follows. What is perhaps insidious in Neihardt's depiction of native heroism is the broadening of a personal tragedy into an inescapable tragedy of a whole people. To swallow too completely his sense of inevitable doom for his heroes creates a subtle but dangerously ahistorical view. If we read the cycle of the West without an awareness of our own recent history, we run the risk of creating a view of Native Americans as forever a subject of the past, not of people who still live here and have a vibrant living tradition and culture. Too much glorification of doomed Indian courage diminishes Indian continued survival, resistance, and flourishing. Now, the Song of the Indian Wars and the final volume, Song of the Messiah, are the two that have gotten the most attention from scholars. And because they have gotten a great deal of scholarly attention, as you might imagine, there's a great deal of scholarly nonsense you have to wade through. But even if this scholar Clausen is not technically wrong, good luck crafting a story where everybody is just like therapeutically self-reflexive and apologetic and PC. But this academic view does signal a very common attitude that has been prevalent, and that's poetry about war never focuses on the glory, it only emphasizes the tragedy and the horror. So, think about how Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, really romanticizes that conflict. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. And then in World War I, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and others captured how horrible that conflict was, and they shifted away from the glory towards the horror and disillusionment. We've pretty much been there ever since. But the fact of the matter is that war is horrible, yes, but there's also glory to be had, and there's also nobility. Homer captures the mixture of this very well in the Iliad, but highbrow 20th century literature does not. And if you want to see that mix, you have to go to film, or you have to go to more commercial novels like Michael Shara's Killer Angels. One thing that makes Neihardt unique in 20th century literature is his Homeric style. He shows the horror and the glory, and that's something that highbrow literature just doesn't do anymore. So, to return to the poem, after this stirring speech from Red Cloud, another chief stands up, Spotted Tail. And Spotted Tail is the voice of reason. He urges the tribes to not be stirred by thoughts of vengeance and seek the better way. But his speech falls on deaf ears, and he's standing abashed and lonely, seeing how his words had left as little trace as do the birds upon the wide insouciance of air. Then Sitting Bull, the great, the famous Sitting Bull, rises, and his speech is even more inflamed than Red Cloud's and gets everybody's blood boiling. Sitting Bull talks about how the white man has just been flooding the land and breaking promises, and just quote in the end, he says, Shall we cower, dumb, or shall we say, First kill us, here we stand? And Neihardt narrates, Then fury took the crowd, and set it howling with the lust to slay. Neihardt really sets up the drama and the conflict to come with these passages, and so the tribes are now on the warpath. So in the next chapter, chapter 4, Fort Phil Kearny, the first conflict in Red Cloud's war is described. And this particular incident was a skirmish that took place on December 6th, 1866, between Red Cloud's warriors and the troops of Captain William Fetterman. It's interesting how Neihardt narrates this. As we're getting to know his narrative style here, you can probably guess that he chooses to narrate in the close third person rather than choosing a more omniscient perspective. He's describing a long wagon train crawling like a lazy serpent. And suddenly, It seemed a blur of flies arose from each adjacent gulch and break, and, swarming inward, swirled about the snake that strove to coil amid the stinging mass. A nice description. And then the fort awakens to frantic signals, and there's this confused description of the chaos that results. One can see the muffled shout, the twang of bow thongs. Leaping fog blots out the agitated pictures, flattens, spreads. Dull rumblings wake and perish. Tossing heads emerge, and ramrods prickle in the rack. A wheel mule, sprouting feathers at his back, rears like a clumsy bird essaying flight, and falls to vicious kicking. And the description then seamlessly merges with free indirect speech as 40 troopers ride out and Captain Fetterman is yelling at them, "Hurry, men! The rabid dogs are rushing in again. Look, hurry! Know the break midway." They see the squadron dashing up. They turn, they flee before that pack of terriers like rats. Yell, yell, you lucky loggers, wave your hats and thank the captain that you've kept your hair. And the rest of the fight is narrated like this in this free indirect speech of yelling. So again, as in earlier installments, Neihardt's narration does convey what it's actually like to be in the thick of an ambush. The dominant emotions here are panic and confusion. The realism comes through. But I found myself yet again being just slightly dissatisfied here as a reader. I was just honestly wanting a straight up fight scene. Not in a way that will necessarily glorify the violence. If anything, gory details like those described by, say, Wilfred Owen in his World War I poetry really hit home just how brutal war is. And Neihardt hasn't really delivered on that brutal gruesomeness yet. I feel like Neihardt is conveying the fog of war here, but not the heat of battle, if that makes sense. While in his static nature descriptions he goes into full omniscient God's Eye mode and gives these very sublime and sweeping descriptions, he just isn't doing this with the action scenes. So the scene is now set for the Fetterman fight, when Captain Fetterman and 80 of his men were massacred by Crazy Horse. People tend not to remember the Fetterman fight because the Custer fight was worse at the Battle of Little Bighorn, but the Fetterman fight was the worst military disaster that they had faced up to that time. And the way Neihardt prepares us for this is by describing the winter solstice. The morrow came, a peaceful scarlet morn. It seemed the homesick sun in Capricorn had found new courage for the homeward track, and, yearning out across the zodiac to Cancer, brightened with the conjured scene of grateful hills and valleys flowing green, sweet incense rising from the rain-soaked sward, and color shouts of welcome to the Lord and Savior. It's a sublime, natural description of rebirth and renewal that weaves in religious symbolism of salvation, that almost rises to the level of allegory for the Indian side, and is, for Fetterman's troops, highly ironic. It's passages like this where Neihardt's literary genius really shines through most clearly, and I think he's at his best when he's doing this. So, Fetterman is described as a specter as he rides out to his doom on this fateful morning of December 21st, 1866. And I was wondering whether Neihardt was going to continue with his tendency to just narrate things indirectly. But, to my great appreciation, he does not. The next chapter, Rubbed Out, is just a straightforward battle description, and after so much indirect action and reflective symbolism that has occurred throughout this epic, I found this chapter very satisfying. There are great descriptions of bodies of men fighting, and of individuals. Then presently, men say, a white chief reeled, rolled from his saddle, like a man gone daft, got up and doddered, tugging at a shaft that sprouted from his belly. Then a yell of many bowmen mocked him as he fell, his writhing body feathered like a goose. That feathered like a goose is a really visceral metaphor of what it looks like to be shot full of arrows. So the battle itself takes up maybe 100 lines, 150 at most. It's narrated from the perspective of the Indian side, and as opposed to the panic and confusion of the whites in the previous skirmish, this description is much more Homeric, and as a reader, you share in the excitement and bloodlust of what it must have been like to be an angry Lakota tribesman bred for war and finally able to take your revenge. It is a short chapter, And there's a great detail after the battle's over and all the white troops have been killed to a man. The last creature alive is some trooper's wolfhound mourning for his friend, who loped forward, pausing now and then to cry his urgent question to the hostile sky that spat a stinging frost. And one of the warriors says, "Let the dog go to bear tidings of the dead," to be a messenger essentially. But another disagrees, saying, "No, teach them that we do not even spare their dogs." And so an arrow sang shrill to the mark. The wolfhound yelped and sprang, snapped at the feather, wilted, and was still. So you can actually read a prose account of this battle in the complete edition of Black Elk Speaks. It's a first-hand account that is not provided by Black Elk, but by Fire Thunder. So Neihardt is going off of first-hand accounts and of people he actually talked to, and it's interesting to compare this passage that I just read with Fire Thunder's description in Black Elk Speaks. And so comparing the documents, you can see how Neihardt compressed and poeticized Fire Thunder's description to accord with the more elevated style of the epic genre. So here's what Fire Thunder says about the wolfhound not being spared. They had a dog with them, and he started back up the road for the soldiers' town, howling as he ran. He was the only one left. I did not shoot him because he looked too sweet, but many did shoot, and he died full of arrows. So there was nobody left of the soldiers. So you can see how Fire Thunder is not giving a detailed description of the dog's death or anything. He just said that the dog died full of arrows. And it's interesting to see how Neihardt compresses many arrows into one very poetical arrow, and invents the detail about the wolfhound snapping at the feather poking out of his side before wilting and dying. So Neihardt is clearly doing a lot more here than just metricizing what Fire Thunder and Black Elk say, just fitting their statements into iambic pentameter and adding end rhymes. He's really doing a lot of work to construct a compelling and coherent narrative. I think it's very interesting that the episodes based on first-hand accounts are narrated much more objectively and straightforwardly than the earlier narratives of fur trappers that leaned more heavily on written accounts. It kind of seems to be the case that Neihardt distrusted the written accounts more than the first-hand accounts. Like his fur trapper epics are perspectivized even where he was getting his information from history books as opposed to just journals. And then in his Indian epics, he's taking first-hand accounts and synthesizing them to construct an omniscient narration. And we are now more than 350 pages into this epic cycle, and this account of the Fetterman Massacre is the first time we get a clear picture of an extended action sequence that is unmarred by interpretive difficulties. This reminded me of something that the literary theorist Paul de Man once wrote, that whenever people read biography and autobiography, they're always asking, how much of this did the author just make up? Whereas when people read a novel, they're always asking, how much of this did the author base on real life? So, in Chapter 8, we are introduced to George Armstrong Custer. Not yet a general in 1868, just a lieutenant colonel, and this chapter is about his confrontation with Black Kettle, an Indian warrior who popped up previously and had survived another fight but gets killed here. Then in Chapter 9, we encounter Crazy Horse. Now, he had already been mentioned early on in the story, but we delve deeper into his character and observe the ever-growing Indian Confederation. Crazy Horse, of course, is probably the most famous Native American of all time, partly due to this guy, Korzak Kiolowski, a Polish immigrant who, despite not having any formal arts training, just decided that he was going to create the largest statue in history and spent his entire adult life sculpting Crazy Horse's face in the side of this mountain in the Black Hills, which I've been to, and it's incredible. And Ziolowski, by the way, had 10 children who are all carrying on his work. So back to the poem, we are heading for a showdown here and the climax of the epic. And we finally come to this in chapter 12, which is probably the most exciting chapter of the entire epic saga. The Battle of Little Bighorn. Now the chapter is pretty long, but Neihardt doesn't spend that much time focusing on Custer's role once the fighting starts. Neihardt shifts around a lot and only devotes about 75 lines to the Little Bighorn itself. And Custer is only mentioned once by name. And that's because we're not really sure what happened to Custer, we're not sure how he and his men died, as it explains in the footnotes of this chapter. This is why footnotes are so helpful, because unless you've read a lot of history of the time, you wouldn't otherwise know this stuff. Neihardt, for once, departs from strict historical accuracy to describe the death of General Custer and his 5 companies. And here's how it goes. Then a shouting ringed the battle, and the scene went out in rumbling dust, as though a mine were lit beneath the summit and the belch of it gloomed bellowing. A window gloaming spread across the ridges flicked with errant lead, and wayward arrows groping for a mark, and horses hurtled from the central dark, with empty saddles charged upon the day. That's it. No mention of General Custer specifically or any of his men. Here's what footnote 43 of chapter 12 says about this passage. Neihardt's Impressionism emphasizes not an objective, precise, step-by-step chronology, but disparate images that coalesce to create a vivid word picture. Like a Monet or a Renoir, Neihardt is not so much presenting reality as he is suggesting a mood. Then the annotator Joe Green notes that this style is appropriate because of the uncertainty of the situation. Now, personally, I would have really loved to see just an epic showdown between Custer and Crazy Horse, and both of them just like fighting to the death. Because if you can't say with certainty what happened, maybe you can't say with certainty that it didn't happen like that. Now, obviously, historians would wag their fingers at you, and you wouldn't really get a lot of respect in the scholarly community for elevating the entertainment level so absurdly. And this leads me to reflect that maybe this is why epics rooted in fantasy or mythology are just so much more popular than epics rooted in history. Because you can just make everything up, and no one will fault you for making the story as wildly entertaining as possible. You can have Aragorn fighting the Nazgul, you can have a showdown between Eowyn and the Witch King of Angmar, and people will say it's great. But if you mythologize history like Homer and Virgil did, it doesn't really work in an era where there are so many historical records now. You'll get flack for it. Unless maybe you do it in a tongue-in-cheek manner where you acknowledge the absurdity of what you're doing, and even play up the absurdity. But so, back to the poem, all the soldiers are killed, and meanwhile, since Custer has divided his troops up, the other men on Reno Hill were not aware of Custer's fate yet, since they didn't even know his exact location. They talked of Custer, grumbling at a name already shaping on the lips of fame to be a deathless bugle singing soon. For no one guessed what now the tardy moon was poring over with a face of fright out yonder. Naked bodies gleaming white the whole way to the summit of the steep where silence, brooding on a tumbled heap of men and horses, listened for a sound. A wounded troop horse sniffed the bloody ground, and ghosts of horses nickered when he neighed. So these last 2 lines actually reference the sole survivor of the Custer fight. Yes, there was a survivor of the Custer fight, and that survivor was not a man, but a horse. And this is such an incredible story. This horse, Comanche, is so famous that he has a full biography devoted to him on Wikipedia. So Comanche was severely wounded at the Little Bighorn. Obviously, the captain who rode him was killed, but he was found 2 days later and transported back to Fort Lincoln. And there, Comanche was nursed back to health. He was accorded this venerable, almost religious status, like he was given this comfortable stable where no one was allowed to ride him or put him to work. He was handsomely fed and groomed. On formal occasions, he was dressed up and paraded with the regiment, and he had to wear this garment of mourning, the grief kind of mourning, not the sunrise kind. And he lived for another 15 years. When he died in 1891, he was given a military funeral. Only 4 horses have ever been given military funerals, and Comanche was then stuffed and put on display. And you can see him on display today in the Natural History Museum at the University of Kansas. So after I read about this, I just had to check this out, since I live close by in Kansas City. So I met up with my friend and fellow poet, Stephen Dickey, and he took this picture of me in front of the stuffed horse. So back to the main story, it is a great victory for Crazy Horse and his confederation. And yet in the next chapter, we see how things start to unravel for the Indian tribes as the noose tightens and many start to realize that they just can't stop the encroachment of white civilization. So the victory at Little Bighorn had tragic consequences, Because the army starts coming out in force, a lot of tribes are being attacked, villages ransacked, their children are starving, they're making peace treaties. It's taking a toll on those who refuse to yield. Red Cloud, who is so jingoistic at the opening of the story, is described as getting gray before his time, a cougar in a cage, self-eaten by a silent, toothless rage. And Crazy Horse was like a man who, having seen a ghost, must look and brood upon the empty way it took to nowhere, and he scarcely ate at all. And there was that about him like a wall to shut men out. He seemed no longer young. And this epic closes with chapter 14, The Death of Crazy Horse. It's an incredibly moving chapter, and we have a beautifully written scene of Crazy Horse's surrender. So Crazy Horse came in with twice 1,000 beggars, and the din died out, though here and there a dog still howled, for now the mighty one, whom fate had fouled, dismounted, faced the silent double row of soldiers haughty with the glint and glow of steel and brass. A little while he stood, as though bewildered in a haunted wood of men and rifles all astare with eyes. They saw a giant shrunken to the size of any sergeant. Now he met the glare of dull knife, and his warriors waiting there with fingers itching at the trigger guard. How many comrade faces, strangely hard, were turned upon him. Ruefully he smiled, the doubtful supplication of a child caught guilty, loosed his bonnet from his head, and cast it down. I come for peace, he said. Now let my people eat. And that was all. The summer ripened. Presages of fall now wanted nothing but the goose's flight. The goldenrods had made their torches bright against the ghostly imminence of frost. And one, long brooding on a birthright lost, remembered and remembered. Oh, the time when all the prairie world was white with rime of mornings, and the lodge smoke towered straight to meet the sunlight, coming over late for happy hunting. Oh, the days when winds kept silence in their far blue haze to hear the deep-grassed valleys running full with fatling cows, and thunders of the bull across the hills. Nights given to the feast when big round moons came smiling up the east to listen to the drums, the dancing feet, the voices of the women high and sweet above the men's. And Crazy Horse was sad. So Crazy Horse is here reflecting on a golden age before the encroachment of white civilization. It's very touching. And Crazy Horse is then betrayed and killed, and that is the end of the Song of the Indian Wars. So again, I think this is the best of the 5 epics in the cycle. If I were to put forth a criticism of Neihardt here, I feel like he is insufficiently detailed in his descriptions of the battle scenes. And this is just true of his action scenes more generally. He tends to kind of gloss over them. When I compare him to, say, my favorite epic authors like Ariosto, Tasso, Spencer, they give these blow-by-blow descriptions of the fight scenes, and it makes it very visceral, like you can see it unfolding in your mind as you're reading this. And Neihardt doesn't really do this. He tends to summarize action events and gloss over them briefly, and then he'll stop and paint a vivid picture of the battlefield or the nature scene or something very static and contemplative. Again, he's very adept at these contemplative scenes of sublimity or melancholy, less so when it comes to stirring the blood with rousing action sequences. Although I did feel this at times, there are exciting passages, certainly. I just felt like they were insufficiently limbed. I mean, I know he was trying to stick to the historical accounts based on what we know, but when you don't fictionalize things sufficiently, the narrative just suffers. And again, this is why epics based on historical subjects are considered kind of second rate compared to those based on mythology and religious subjects, and why in modern times the genre of epic is being filled by fantasy. And in this way, I would compare A Cycle of the West to the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes, which tells the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. It's a great story, but the great parts are interspersed with long passages of speeches and build up to get to action sequences that are over just too quickly. Most of Chapter 3, for example, is spent with Jason trying to convince Medea's father to help him out on his quest, and there's all this build-up to when he has to tame these fire-breathing bulls and fight the Earthborn men. You're just like waiting to get to these parts, And then when you finally get to these scenes at the end of the chapter, Jason dispatches the bulls and takes care of the Earthborn men in the space of just a handful of lines. And this as opposed to Homer, who just revels in the gory details. Apollonius does not revel in the gory details. His action sequences are very cursory. And while Neihardt is not as cursory as Apollonius in this respect, I found myself thinking kind of the same thing. Now, in defense of Neihardt, action sequences were less important to him than the expression of his mystical worldview. And my criticism does show my own bias because I am prejudiced towards the kinds of things that I like to write myself, which, of all the American poets I've discovered so far, Neihardt does come the closest. I think Neihardt has written some of the best action adventure poetry of the 20th century, if not the best, but he doesn't really have a lot of competition there. Free verse just seems particularly unsuited to this kind of thing for some reason. And I think it's interesting that despite the dominance of the Hollywood blockbusters in popular culture, Hollywood seems to have had literally no influence at all on the modern poetry world. If anything, poets are very elitist and they intentionally react against pop culture. And while I'm not saying every aspect of pop culture should be embraced, a lot of it is garbage. There's a lot of great stuff too. The Revenant is one of these great examples, and again, we wouldn't have that without Neihardt. So while I'm criticizing Neihardt in regards to his action sequences, because even masterpieces have flaws, it's important to note that my appreciation greatly outweighs my criticism. I will return next week with part 3 of this episode to talk about Song of the Messiah and conclude with some reflections on John Neihardt's legacy. Thank you.